South Africa. The difference with South Africa, though, relative to the other developed countries, is South Africa is going through a process of transformation. So you now have a level of power that's given to certain individuals, in this case, the commissioner, to exercise that power at his own discretion, but without the checks and balances that have grown in the other constitutions. So, for example, if you were a taxpayer in the United States and your local receiver of revenue in some way abused you and tried to coerce you into some form of settlement, the checks and balances are so strong that if that turned out to be true, he would lose his job, he'd face criminal prosecution, he would go to jail. South Africa, the situation is different. And it's different partly because of transformation. And we were in a situation where we've got this wonderful constitution, but without the right caretakers. And I think that applies to SARS, because if you take SARS' position, you go along and you get a commissioner, and you appoint Pravin Gordhan as the commissioner, almost 10 years ago now. And what are you demanding of Pravin Gordhan? What you are saying to him, and what perhaps the country required of him, was to change the tax culture of South Africa. So his main mandate was to say, you go out there, guys, don't pay their taxes. It's a national sport in South Africa, and it was a national sport, not to pay tax. People used to boast about how much tax they didn't pay. That's what life was like at that point in time. Everyone had offshore trusts and money was hidden. So they said to the commissioner, you've got to change this. But how do you actually change it? You've got a constitution that says to the commissioner, you've got to be fair, and you've got to do all of this. And the only way that he can change it is in his own mind, suspending his obligations under the constitution by saying, no, I know that every single taxpayer is a crook. And unless you prove otherwise, I'm going to assume you're a crook. And I'll tell you who else are crooks. It's all the guys who are not taxpayers that should be taxpayers. So the commissioner went out on a mission which was necessary for the country. I'm not in any way suggesting there wasn't the need for the tax culture to change in South Africa. There was an absolute need for it. But the fact is that need was in complete conflict to the Constitution. So what the commissioner had to do is he had to suspend, in a way, his belief in the Constitution and say, I'm actually not going to allow due process to happen because due process doesn't work. I've got to change the culture of how people think about tax. And the only way I can do that is being aggressive. I'm going to take destroying people's lives as a tax collection technique, not as a last resort. I'm not really saying to someone, you know, guys, I've engaged you as best as I can. King, you're non-cooperative, you don't want to speak to me. Then whatever happens to you, but you're bringing it upon yourself. That's not what he was doing. He was saying, you're all crooks, and I will destroy lives as a tax collection technique. I will criminalize the tax collection system. I believe the number of times, if you ever could get information, that the commissioner has laid criminal charges only to withdraw them, and I have this from the NPA directly. The number of times the NPA themselves are completely fed up with the extent to which the commissioner lays criminal charges, and as soon as he gets the right check, he withdraws the criminal charges. It's actually a tax collection technique. It's miles away from the Constitution. It's not even permissible for him to do that. Why does he do it? Because he had a mandate to change the tax culture. Suspend the Constitution. Suspend people's rights. Use the pay now, fight later basis. I mean, I've had stories which are horrendous. I mean, mine looks like a good story compared to some of the other ones, but I've had people coming to me as some beacon of, you know, telling me their stories. I get emails, I get phone calls, and I've had it over the years where you've had people, I remember the one case where SARS went along and they said the guy with him $7 million. Froze his bank accounts, froze his businesses, shut him down. Shut him down. What does he do? Because SARS have the powers. They take the money out of your bank account. Before you know it, your assets are frozen. He doesn't even have a rand. He doesn't even have a rand to go and pay a lawyer. What do? You settle. SARS say, okay, I've taken all your assets. How much do you want back? You want 20% back. And they completely control the process. And that's one of the difficulties that I have with the Commissioner. I think that what he has done to change the tax culture in South Africa is arguably permissible. Let's say he suspended the Constitution. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, can I ask a question just to follow
Sure,
up?
sure.
Stephen Curtis from 702 Eyewitness News. You said there were many cases where he had laid charges and withdrawn.
Yes.
Do you have any indication of how many? Are you able to give us?
That's what I'm saying. If you could find out, but certainly in discussions I've had with the NPA directly, so I'm talking now where they have said to me that if you knew the number, in fact, to the point where I know the NPA have said to me personally that they got to the point where they had friction with the commissioner, where they said to the commissioner himself, we're not your Jimmy Abbott. We're not some lumbering brute that you can come along as your debt collector. That's not what we're about. We've got more respect in ourselves than that. And they were very, very frustrated about that. In fact, Leonard McCarthy in particular, to quote one name, I can tell you, was very frustrated by that. I think to the point that he didn't speak to the commissioner for quite a while. Can you argue that was the right thing? In a way, you're saying, well, okay, maybe as a developing nation, maybe South Africa shouldn't have had a constitution that holds them to a higher standard. Maybe we shouldn't hold our officials to a higher standard. I know when I go to the courts, the courts are quite a scary place to go sometimes. You go before there, and when I started this process, I had some belief that kind of somehow if you had a good case and it went before the courts, you'd a fairly learned judge there, and he would make some form of rational decision based on the law. But because of transformation, you don't have that anymore. You have the Constitution again sitting there, but this transformation kills the Constitution. And it's the same with the judiciary. Under normal circumstances, if you look at what's happening right now, there's a parallel to the SARS position. Under normal circumstances, you would have an individual who's got a legal background. He would then go through a process of training. He may go to the bar. He becomes a junior counsel. Over time, he becomes a senior counsel. He then starts to become an acting judge, and over time, he eventually becomes a judge. But that individual has gone through a process, and in that process, if he's got what it takes, he'll get there, and if he hasn't, he won't get there. But having gone through that process, it would be very unusual to have a judge, an old-school judge who's gone through the process, who would, in fact, if he had a dispute with the judge president, would take it to the press. He wouldn't do that. He'd have more respect for the institution. He may feel aggrieved, and I'm sure they often are. They're not going to rush off to the press because he's been schooled in the traditions and the respect for the institution. But what you have with transformation, when transformation becomes an event instead of a process, and that's what's happening in South Africa, it becomes an event, then all of a sudden you've got a judge that used to be an attorney in Rustenburg, and next week he's a judge. We went to court the one time, and I think, Gilbert Marcus and Matthew Chaskelson arguing for me, and he gave 3 gazillion constitutional court. They spent ages arguing. And then on the other side, I think Philip Ginsburg, on behalf of the state, gave millions and millions of cases. The judge went for a comfort break and came back and gave his ruling. Even SARS were astounded. There was a ruling against me, of course, but even SARS were astounded that someone who had only been a judge for a week and a half had somehow memorized every constitutional court case that Gilbert had given him and every one Ginsburg had given him, but he gave a ruling in 10 minutes. Why did he do it? It's just part of the system. In fact, if I look at even the Jacob Zuma situation, for someone who's had the exposure I've had to the courts, and I see people writing in the press saying Jacob Zuma should have his day in court. Having your day in court, even if you're completely innocent, and I have got issues to face. I'm not saying that I'm squeaky clean. I genuinely have a case to answer. There's no doubt about that. But